important interior disposition we have towards others needs to be expressed in some way. Things we do with our bodies, given that our bodies are matter that are formed by a rational soul. Motions, movements, again, gestures, positions are natural signs. There's a kind of interior natural connection between these things and their spiritual dispositions. Important to see there's those signs both signify, point out, express, but the key is they also cultivate it. Precisely by expressing, for instance, reverence, it cultivates reverence. By expressing gratitude, it cultivates gratitude. Hi, I'm John Cuddeback.
And I'm Sofia Cuddeback.
If you're wondering whether you can really be friends with your spouse
and raise children into responsible adults with whom you have a relationship
and do what it takes to make a homestead, reconnecting with your body and the land wherever you live.
If you just want to think more about how to make a truly happy home in our trying times,
then the Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast, is for you. Join us. Welcome, everybody. It's always great to be with my wife, Sofia. Our discussion today, the manners crisis and what to do about it. I don't think it's in any way, frankly, an exaggeration to say that we have a crisis. I think a lot of people intuit that we do, kind of on the intuitive level. They have a sense of, wow, we've been progressively losing the practices of manners, and they realize that there's something wrong with that we should have it. I want to say, yeah, it's probably, when we really think about it, it's probably even worse than we realize. In other words, I think the significance of manners is not something that it was always taken for granted, wasn't necessarily expressed conceptually, but now we kind of need to step back and do that. And we realize, wow, if we look at it closely, think about it in terms of fundamental principles, we really do have a problem. It's not going to be easy to address, but we absolutely can address it.
I think maybe before we dive in too deeply, we should right away start from the beginning of just defining, what do we mean by manners? What do you mean when you say manners?
I mean, manners are always external expressions, but they're agreed upon external expressions of interior dispositions toward other persons. So the word conventional could be used there, although it's a technical term and it can be misunderstood and taken negatively.
Yeah, it has a negative connotation.
But the point is, it can vary from culture to culture in just what those external expressions look like. And that's why we say kind of agreed upon. There's that aspect of, well, this is how it's done in this community, in this society, in this culture. But it's always some type of external expression, but it's one that has a key connection to an interior disposition, important interior dispositions, moral dispositions, very significant dispositions toward other people. So very simple example forms of saying, please pass the, something at the table. This is the word is agreed upon, maybe even when it's said, how it's said, but that's an expression of a very important interior disposition that you have already, kind of one of gratitude / petition in that expression, or in ones of expressing a reverence, gratitude, very, very important interior dispositions that are expressed externally. Of course, right off the bat, one recognizes one could utilize these external expressions that have an internal connection to the interior dispositions, but one could use those expressions, say, in a hypocritical way, in a deceptive way, even in a seductive way. So those expressions don't necessarily mean you have that interior disposition, but they are expressions that are naturally understood to go along with certain interior dispositions.
So when we get together with every year we have a high school etiquette dinner in which we take the great opportunity to eat together and to instruct the high schoolers a little bit about manners. One of the things I say to them, and I just want to run this past you, if this fits with your kind of more philosophical explanation than mine would be, that manners are agreed upon behaviors that safeguard the dignity of the other. So there are things that we in a group agree upon that kind of make certain, or kind of vouchsafe in a certain sense, kind of the comfort of the other feeling, being able to feel welcome, to be able to be fully included. They are expressions that make it possible for us to live together in community. So they're conventional in the sense that we come together and agree upon them, but they're also conventional in the sense that they make it possible for us to convene because they express toward the other concern for them. Like, not in the sense of concern in the sense of, oh, I'm anxious, but concern in the sense of, I'm aware of your comfort. I'm aware of your need. I'm aware of what I need to do to make it possible for you to be with me easily.
I think that's excellent. And 100% true. There might be some that are a little bit even broader than that. That is, I think, kind of the heart of manners, but maybe you could just broaden it out a little bit to express all really the key attitudes, dispositions we should have towards other human persons in community. And so it absolutely, yes, makes it, as it were, safe for them, makes it possible for us to come together in a certain kind of way, to have a certain kind of community, the foundation for even closer relationships and friendships that grow out of a community where we, through our manners, cultivate and express really all of the key human dispositions. St. Thomas Aquinas says at one point that given human nature, it's any important interior disposition we have towards others needs to be expressed in some way. This just has to do with our being rational animals, as it were, embodied spirits. So I think this is a very beautiful and important point here, and really is a foundation for why it's important to get down in the weeds and talk about very particular things we do with our body. But the way I put it when I teach the Philosophy of Human Nature course is, given the relationship of soul to body in human persons, the human body, by its various kind of movements and gestures, expresses our natural signs of spiritual dispositions. And a natural sign means one where there's interior connection. Smoke is a natural sign of fire because there's an interior connection between smoke and fire. Things we do with our bodies, given that our bodies are matter that are formed by a rational soul, things we do, motions, movements, again, gestures, positions, that we do with our body are natural signs, even though it's built, how exactly we do it is built up by agreement, by convention, and does vary from culture to culture. Nonetheless, there's a kind of interior natural connection between these things and their spiritual dispositions. So that's the foundation for why Aquinas says we express through these signs our interior dispositions. And I think important to see there is those signs both signify, point out, express, but the key is they also cultivate it. Precisely by expressing, for instance, reverence, it cultivates reverence. By expressing gratitude, it cultivates gratitude. That's why it was always implicitly seen and accepted that these agreed upon ways of acting towards others, we would inculcate, we would have children do before they understand why, with the conviction that they're doing these things, even just certain bodily motions, will be already habituating them to have a certain interior disposition towards the others.
That's a really incredibly beautiful point. It actually makes it very exciting to think that every bodily action that we do is inspired by the spirit that lives within us. So it becomes a way of conveying that which is interior to those who are exterior to us. And I think it's a great place to start the conversation, because the fact of the matter is, when we say the word manners, automatically what comes to people's mind is a certain set of external rules that, if they become stripped of their interior meaning, become a stick to bludgeon people with, and also become a way of offending people or claiming a certain interior attitude that is in fact absent. And I think that's part of the reason why we began to have a crisis of manners, is that people began to recognize they were empty shells. And so on the one hand, it's beautiful that you can do a courteous motion or action if you don't have that spirit yet fully within you, and it can begin to cultivate that spirit. But it is true that we can strip the action of any interior disposition, and that's what makes these empty actions that have scandalized people. So I think that that's super important to recognize, that we're not talking about, let's reinstitute, standing up when a lady comes in the room. Maybe that will be in the end something that is a natural outgrowth of our conversation. But it's not about just reaching back, taking an external behavior and, smacking it on, so to speak. I think what we really need to go back to is an awareness or understanding what is the interior disposition that we need to cultivate, that then kind of sheds an aha moment on why we did those external things. And there'll be certain of them that we'll bring back because those principles still apply. And there'll be other ones that don't really fit our cultural context anymore. But the interior disposition and understanding the dispositions that we want to cultivate will really help us navigate this road of reclaiming and reinstituting something that there certainly has been kind of a rift.
Amen. It's always about the interior dispositions. It's always about persons and in just interior dispositions we have towards one another. But part of that then is also to recognize that there's an essential connection between those interior dispositions in these external actions.
Absolutely.
Here's a very interesting point. The fact that people point out, hey, you can have people who have the external dispositions without the internal. People look at that, and this is understandable, but we have to be very careful. They think, well, what matters is the interior, so let's focus on what's important and strip away the unimportant.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that they do that is because they know that there are people who can focus on the external to the exclusion of the internal, or worse, who will use external signs to make people think that they have those interior dispositions. And this is evil. For instance, the classic seducer is someone who normally is very well mannered. And part of precisely how he seduces is he comes across as having good interior disposition. But then he's able to get away with doing bad things because he deceived through the external signs. But I think this actually shows the importance of manners rather than the unimportance. In other words, that we find that so offensive means we naturally have a sense that, hey, these external signs do go with these interior dispositions. And if you dare use these external signs without the interior dispositions, you're a seducer, or if not, in the case, you're a hypocrite. You're a hypocrite because you've separated what shouldn't have been separated. You've acted as though you were this when you were not this. So this brings us back to, hey, don't strip away the external signs. Let's rather give them their right place in the name of the importance of having the right interior dispositions and living together as human persons in a human community, being the embodied persons that we are.
I mean, it just strikes me when you're saying that. I mean, your focus was on the seducer, the one who has the external expression and not the corresponding internal disposition. But let's talk about the flip side, because actually that's what we seem to have a lot now of people who have beautiful internal dispositions, but don't have any habits of external expression. That immediately—
Or weak habits.
Or weak habits. I want to say part of it is because we have let go of the conventional, meaning all agreed upon forms. People who have good intentions often don't know how to express externally the internal disposition. Now, while it's not pernicious the way the reverse, the seducer is, because the seducer is a form of lying. Whereas someone who has the interior disposition but doesn't express it externally is not lying. It's not that kind of, but it is a tragedy nevertheless. Just like lying is a kind of a tragedy. It's a rupture of how things, of the fiber of being. There's a rupture that happens going the other way, which is the rupture of isolation, I think. Because if, St. Thomas says that man must make signs to express externally the interior spirit, then without manners, we've been stripped of that possibility of expressing externally. So it's almost like being mute. How do I, as someone, a spirit and a body, how do I communicate to you the interior spiritual side? Obviously, we have words, but there are other ways of expressing that, should we use words to express them, it would be cumbersome. And so our actions, our way of expressing the interior, our interior conviction, something we see about ourselves, but also what we see about the other. And so when we have interior dispositions with no means of external expression, there's a tremendous amount of frustration that happens, an experience of isolation, of not being seen because you don't have the means of communication.
Good point.
And also an experience of isolation because you don't have a way of bridging the gap between yourself and the other by showing the other that they're important to you. And so I
Yeah,
think there
that's a
is kind
great
of a
point.
rupture in the
Yes.
fiber of
Yep.
being when we don't have appropriate manners of externalizing an internal disposition.
It's a handicap. It's a real loss to the fullness of our life, of our shared life, of the relationships that we're called to have. And I think we
Mm.
can bring out some examples of that right now. Can I read a few lines from Plato's Republic? This
Mhm.
has always so struck me. It doesn't need introduction other than just to say Plato, who interestingly didn't always get right the relationship between soul and body, but nonetheless had a very keen sense of the importance of what we do with our body and the signs that we make, as is clear here. He says, talking about a culture where there's been a decay and manners, customs of manners have been set aside. He says the following: these people will also discover the seemingly insignificant conventions their predecessors have destroyed. I love first of all that. The seemingly insignificant conventions. Things like this: when it is proper for the young to be silent in front of their elders, when they should make way for them or stand up in their presence, the care of parents, hairstyles, the clothes and shoes to wear, deportment, and everything else of that sort. He says, don't you agree? And the person he's talking with says, I do. He goes on, I think it's foolish to legislate about such things. Verbal or written decrees will never make them come about or last. At any rate, Adeimantus, it looks as though the start of someone's education determines what follows. So this is in the context of what
Mm.
education, formation. Note the great practicality of you're not going to have laws in a society that say you have to stand up in the presence of the elderly, you have to hold the door for a woman. These are things that are always left to what the philosophers called custom. Custom goes along with, it complements good laws. Laws are to be more few and about very deep, kind of obvious matters that are directly and immediately in a very serious way tied to the common good. Then you have these other very important areas that are left to custom. So here Plato's laying out for us, yep, you're not going to make laws about it, but by golly, if you lose these seemingly insignificant conventions, you will lose something essential in human life.
Yeah, that's amazing. But actually, it's interesting how that passage just ended. You said laws should not be made about it. And he says, so let's talk about education. So
Yes, right. No,
clearly his
exactly. Right.
answer is
Mm-hmm.
the way we form those customs and safeguard them in a way that makes them really be real and effective is through education.
Amen.
And that's the formation of that interior disposition, which actually, very importantly, it's not just some kind of interior disposition as though you've been given some kind of like ray from heaven that gives you an interior disposition. It's through a kind of contemplating or looking at or thinking, what is the relationship of things? When you recognize the right relationship of things, then you begin to develop the interior dispositions that are appropriate. And isn't that what education is?
Amen.
Is recognizing the relationship of things to one another and what is owed them given that relationship.
So excellent. So let's talk a little bit about in here education, formation. Education in a very broad sense, not just academics. Education,
Right.
Greek word paideia, formation of the whole person. I started to read the line. It says the final outcome of education is a single newly finished person.
Oh, gorgeous.
So,
oh my gosh.
so,
So
but no,
delicious.
given that we're human, it begins very much through especially bodily signs or practices or words that we form our children to. So think about this. This is immediately going to resonate with anyone who's spent much time around little children. You don't sit down to a child and explain. You don't explain to a 3-year-old how you need to respect people because of human dignity, and this is what we mean by respect. But you just simply do things like, first of all, you pattern for them the manners that we're talking about here, and you ask it of them. And so, okay, we always say please. We say, excuse me, Granddaddy, may I please have such and such? Granddaddy's speaking right now, so we wait until he's done speaking.
Yeah.
We say, excuse me, Granddaddy. When he says, yes, dear, then you say, may I please? These things, we convey these kind of forms. Again, it normally includes certain words. It might well include certain gestures. But note how all of that, you don't have to be explaining why. We're just patterning. And already from the start, you can then have a child who is acting in ways that are very respectful And seamlessly, that child tends to grow into having the dispositions that at first the child, all unknowing, was directed to express.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is that in this scenario that you've just described of the 3-year-old, that it's not so important that the 3-year-old understand why, but what is critical is that the person who's doing the guiding understand the why. First of all, because they exude it.
It's very important. I mean, even if he didn't understand it conceivably, right, it could make a difference.
Well, maybe,
right? I mean,
but
sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, it's more like, okay, maybe he couldn't explain it philosophically, but the parent recognizes to just interrupt granddaddy while he's speaking is disrespectful to him. Or if you don't have that sense, we would want to grow in that sense, right? I mean, that's the point. And everyone is capable of that. You don't need to be a philosopher. So we don't need to have a philosophical explanation of why it's appropriate to say, excuse me, and then may I please. But so the reason I say that, especially I'm thinking of the may I please and thank you and all that, as parents, we can teach our children to do that. But we could be teaching them because, oh my gosh, everyone's going to think that my child is an absolute pain in the neck. And they have to say, or what will so-and-so think if my child doesn't say thank you afterwards? Or because it is conventional, there are certain social pressures about governing external behavior. And so that could be partially a parent's motivation to demand a certain kind of behavior that in itself is appropriate. But if the parent's motivation is that they appear right in public, that they say the right thing, that they're not judged, or that probably more likely is that other people aren't judging them badly, then all you're giving them, the child, is the shell. Whereas if the parent is realizing, I want to give them these good manners because it allows them to be able to respect and allow for full communication between themselves and other people in their environment, that's a completely different thing. And I think that's part of what that is a very important part of the education of the children, the drawing out of the child. You're giving them a shell, so to speak, but you're filling it kind of simultaneously as you're giving it with the inner meaning of it.
I absolutely agree. And I mean, I would add, in this time, especially in which we live, we all need to, especially now, refocus and say, why do we do these things? Because if we're going to have to buck ourselves up to be doing something that is, at least sometimes, not generally being done. And we're going to have to talk about that to some extent. This is part of the whole challenge. Customs by their nature are supposed to be communal. So can you teach certain ones, or does it make sense to teach certain ones if literally no one else is doing it? We have to reckon with that. We'll circle back to that very shortly. But just right now, I want to point out, I think there is, and you'll immediately grant this, and you were focusing on a different point, but even the shell, there'd be something worthwhile in the shell, even if the parent doesn't know why. In a certain culture where maybe it's just all completely taken for granted, there's still something positive, I think, being done by children being formed to act and speak in these ways because of an intrinsic connection between those ways of acting and the interior dispositions. I'd rather have a child have been given the shell, even by someone who didn't understand it so well.
Okay, but I'm going to disagree with you here. Not completely, but the point of my disagreement is to say that if it's just a shell, it provides the opportunity for the child to come to a full understanding. If the shell is given to them in a way that disrespects their dignity and their personhood, you're yelling at them, screaming at them, and the way you enforce or make sure that they're doing the good manners is as a way of like disrespecting their person. It literally makes the shell itself become an obstacle for the child learning, coming to intuit the inner meaning of that.
We're not disagreeing on that.
And I know you don't, but I think it's worthwhile pointing that out, because especially if we are convicted about the importance of the external disposition, and we live in a world that doesn't support us. As parents, we can, through a certain kind of anxiety to do a good thing, accidentally undo it by losing sight of the person.
That's a great point.
And it's just, as a parent, that's my experience as a parent, that in my anxiety to do the right thing, I would lose sight of the person that I was trying to do the right thing by, right? And it sounds inconceivable, but in my experience, it happened a lot. And so, and I think it's important to say that right now in connection with manners, because I think manners in particular, that's happened with manners in particular. And many people have been hurt by the external signs being imposed on them in a way that didn't respect their dignity as a person. And therefore they then have this allergic reaction. So we have to get to the point where we don't have an allergic reaction to giving the signs. So we have to, in a certain sense, we have to reclaim the sign again. We have to almost like rebaptize it, make it okay, because that type of bludgeoning people with the rule is part of the reason people have an adverse reaction. Or in any case, even if they personally don't, they've picked up the rhetoric against it. Because let's face it, committing to external signs of manners costs us something in effort and energy. And there are many people who would be free of that labor, and so very conveniently take up the rhetoric of how bad it is to impose signs on people.
I hear you.
So in order for us to be successful, I think we just have to recognize that and kind of meet it straight on.
The other thing that seems to me that points out to, that it goes hand in hand with that, is what we're talking about right now is not fundamentally just a matter of what we need to give to the young. This is probably a good time to say, a lot of our manners are weak, are decayed. We don't take these things as seriously as we should. And so we need to begin with ourselves. And so all such important things in life always give us an opportunity to try to grow in self-knowledge and to recognize how, if we're going to be an effective instrument of bringing about good, you can't give what you don't have. So we have to be cultivating the right interior disposition, the right understanding of how these exterior signs are an important expression of the interior disposition. And we need to be willing to make the sacrifice to be, shall we simply say, well-mannered ourselves. And because it is perhaps part of the problem, reason that the formation of manners, even by some who are trying to do it, doesn't go so well, is because we can fall into, this is important that we tell the young people, but we're not really leading by example. So, I mean, probably the main goad, the main influence on the young to be well-mannered is to see the beauty of a well-mannered life in those around them, in their parents, in their grandparents, in their mentors, in their teachers. So to start to get a little more practical here, let's just say in the home, let's think about that. How are our own manners in how we speak? If we're married, how are we speaking to our spouse? Is it absolutely always in a very respectful way, even consistently using forms of respect, of endearment, of deference, of gratitude, of petition? Are we men constantly patterning a certain kind of consistent mannered approach towards women? Are we consistently showing that when the elderly come, say, and visit our house, we come upon them in public, we always treat them with a certain deference, that we never make fun, make light, criticize.
Treat them like an inconvenience.
We don't want to be critical. True. We don't want to be critical of people in general anyway, but I mean, especially then towards the elderly. This is where we start to see these are key dispositions that many of us perhaps don't have, that the elderly, simply because they're elderly, are to be reverenced. That to some extent, women, simply because they're women, demand a certain care by men. And this right now is not the moment to try to kind of go more into exactly what is the beautiful insight behind that. There is a beautiful insight. There's so much behind why is it that Scripture says that the hoary head is to be reverenced, right? That says something about what it is to be human, what the end or goal of human life is. But for the moment, can we just we should be able to take certain of those things for granted, right? At least we know, even if the practice of it hasn't been passed on, we still have a recollection of, yes, men treat women in a certain way. We all treat the elderly in a certain way. We respect all. We show gratitude. We make petition in a certain kind of way. We in social situations are always begin by listening. We don't interrupt, and so forth. I mean, we should start to look at kind of those different areas because it does come to that. But I thought, first of all, that principle, we all will benefit from asking, how are we exercising these external forms, these kind of shared signs? How are we doing that as a key part of who we are.
I just want to refer to, that's a great point. It's really almost caught me a little bit by surprise that you used as an example the interaction of spouses with one another. So that's an area where you feel super at home, super comfortable, super like this is where you get to let your hair down, so to speak. I mean, this is the place where you are most comfortable. I mean, at least ideally in some respect.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of when you said, are we observing certain manners of or habits of expression, of petition, of courtesy, I thought to myself, I just want to advert to that because it sounds like what you're suggesting is a certain kind of self-conscious formality in our interaction in an area that's actually very intimate. When people go, oh, I don't, that wouldn't be very fun if I was always having to make sure I said things a certain way. And I think this is a great moment to kind of underscore that maybe initially it takes a certain kind of vigilance and say, I'm going to always blah, or I'm going to always blah. It does take a certain kind of vigilance. Very quickly, it becomes a habit. And as you've always said about man, the sign maker, we're capable of making signs, but we're also capable of being formed by the sign. And very quickly, does that habit of interaction actually change your interior disposition towards your spouse? And isn't that a beautiful thing to think of? That when it becomes a habit and you're no longer being self-conscious about always referring to your spouse as dear or saying thank you, or would you mind if, or whatever the habit you're trying to develop actually becomes a natural expression of your interior disposition of gentleness, respect, reverence, and deference for your spouse. Wow. That's really an amazing thought, that what appears as this kind of almost unreal, like courtesy and gentleness between spouses actually becomes their interior disposition toward one another.
That's great.
It's a really, now this doesn't mean that there aren't times where you get angry or upset, but usually in those, and you have to express that. But if there is some kind of inappropriate expression of or hurtfulness, the regular habit of courtesy allows you to come back and say, I'm really sorry. I was just having a bad day. And so I love that image, the thought of what is initially a practiced habit becoming actually a very fluid interior disposition, habitual daily disposition toward your spouse. That makes a very happy household.
Indeed. May I put it in a slightly different way, but the same point? A certain formality is actually the freeing context to have a greater freedom in expressing, enacting the things that are so critical, so important, so beautiful in our relationships with people. Belloc in an essay referred to how, and it was, I think, it was in Mowing of a Field, where he refers to here in our area, in Sussex, that part of Sussex, in a case, he said, we refer to one another as Mr., even if we were rocked in the same cradle. And now, this is conventional. This can be different things, but we're in such an informal age. It just starts to have a little bit more of a sense of the goodness, the richness, the appropriateness of some formality. Form means shape, gives beautiful, that which is beautiful must have form. Manners give shape to our interactions. And they're wise. This is, again, Plato saying they'll discover the seemingly insignificant conventions their predecessors have destroyed. Often good manners, good conventions of how we interact were forms that wise experience has shown give the boundaries, give the context to set you free for
absolutely.
Deeper personal connection. Dear, I've told this before, but I share again the quick story of you and the welcome back dance or kind of event barn party that we have for students. And I remember this years ago, you pointed out how you feel so sorry for even people from good families. And this is where this isn't a matter of self-flagellation. It's just a matter of we all need to wake up a little bit and at least be aware of this. We're not going to be able to solve the problem overnight. It's a broader communal problem. It doesn't mean at least we need to understand it. Then we can think of ways of addressing it. But young people have fundamentally lost any of the formalities of how you meet and greet people. So then you put all these young people together in a social situation. They don't have the forms that would give them the context to be able to meet one another and actually start a conversation. So what's the upshot of that? Is not that they get to have really natural, informal communication. They have almost nothing.
And they're super awkward.
They're super awkward.
It's very stressful
for them. Whereas if these had been formed in certain forms of good afternoon. I'm from such and such place. May I ask where you're from? Something as simple as that, that they were taught, look, if there's someone, that a man is taught, especially say towards a young lady, introduce yourself, say your name, say where you're from, and then without being intrusive, ask something about her. And in the worst case scenario, if there's nothing else, comment on the weather. This is people that, that's that, and then they, Darcy speaking to Elizabeth, it was awkward when he said, well, and how are your parents? This is actually a form that's a very beautiful form that was kind of a standard. You inquire after someone's parents. You and I noticed this still, the old timers around here still just kind of, it's kind of an automatic in a
How's
conversation, and your father, and this, think of the beauty behind that form. Think of the interior disposition of the importance of parents, that surely it would be important to you how your parents are doing. I will express concern for you by asking about your parents. Again, if young people had certain more of those forms, it would allow them to have conversations and not just kind of, kind of start out with kind of, you want to watch a movie, or whatever,
or to just kind of fall back on what is in fact the most available, which is kind of the energy between young men and young women, and they get into a relationship right away, because they don't have other means of interacting. The only mean that they can fall back on is kind of what's kind of at root, kind of naturally there, is the physical attraction between a boy and a girl.
Good point. Maybe even then they'll be looking for a comment that might even be on the edge of rude or crude for the sake of kind of trying to start something there. Whereas manners give an appropriate, reserved, and modest, but real opportunity with an appropriate distance, but allowing you to kind of come close. That's just an example of form giving freedom.
I love that, form giving freedom. And I'm just going to give a slightly more positive example, because that was a little bit of a negative example. We just recently went to a graduation party of some dear friends. Their son is graduating, and the parents are themselves very gracious, or very well-mannered and very gracious hosts, from kind of stemming from an interior disposition and excellent exterior habits. And they've passed those on to their children. And you and I, coming home in the evening, were just saying how delightful it was, their teenage daughter and their son graduating from college, how they clearly had good habits of looking. We know them, but they're not our friends. And yet each of them, the children, each of them, when they approached us, looked us in the eye, called us by name, said, how are you doing? Thank you so much for coming, in a way that it was clear they had the forms of how you're supposed to interact with the friends of your parents. And they had grown up that way. And so for them, those forms were easy. And it gave us the freedom for having this communication with them and it was clear they had a certain freedom of interacting with us because they had these forms to help them. And so it was this delightful contact of, I felt like I encountered the person. And, you meet a lot of lovely young people nowadays who are genuinely good kids, but don't have those forms. And it's just a kind of a barrier that has to be overcome slowly over time. And you feel their awkwardness. Whereas these children were freed from the awkwardness of the interaction because they had been given the tools of behavior. Great example.
Well, then let's start to talk more kind of specific things. I think already right there, then that great example allows us to focus on one simple thing. Let's start with, relationship between different ages. A central aspect of inculcating manners in the young is how you act towards adults. And the point is not, of course, that adults are more important than you are. They have greater interior dignity than you do, but simply because they are further along in the astounding journey of human life, they are to be treated accordingly. And they, in general, the young should have a disposition of, obviously, you're not going to learn something from every person who's older, but you do have generally a disposition of listening.
Because it allows you to learn. That.
Exactly. And it allows you to start to have a relationship where, again, you wish, I often, as a teacher, as just an adult in the community, the parish, whatever, wish that young people were more comfortable in interacting with me, because that would allow me to be a presence in their life in a different kind of way. But if they have not been taught certain forms of even just simply, good morning, Mr. Cutterback. Good morning, Professor Cutterback. Hello. Just a simple thing. Greet adults. And if you know them, greet them by their name. If they have a title and you're aware of their title, greet them. use their name and their title.
Mhm.
Already today, first of all, makes you stand out. The point is not to stand out in a good way, but the point isn't to stand out. The point is the adult immediately is able to relate to you in a very positive way
Mhm.
that certainly is not as likely otherwise.
Yeah, and a
We
huge
can
part
just
of
start
that is
there.
pausing. It's almost a little bit of a pause, and eye contact is
Hmm.
super important. Almost that pause is the thing that says, "Oh, I will provide an opportunity should something come." You know, you're not going to learn something from every adult you pass, but it's your job to provide an opportunity. So you provide an opportunity by it's a slight interior pause, but also looking them in the eye when you greet them by name. You never just walk past an adult.
Right. I mean, and this are some of
We're
the
talking about adults in your community. So we're not talking about being on a crowded city street. You have to pause before every adult, and you certainly are teaching young in a community circle. So the people in your community are the people that you would teach your children to show that deference to. So
right.
that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
It starts in our home. And so let's think about kind of practical things starting in the home.
Mhm.
If we, hospitality is a key aspect of this, how we interact with people that come to the door. Again, so much of what we're patterning ourselves. Someone comes to the door. If I'm kind of running into meeting someone who's definitively, older,
Mhm.
that unless I already have a close relationship, I'm going to address that person with a title,
Mhm.
right? Hello, Mr. So and So. I hope that you're well,
Mhm.
right? And so again, we pattern that, but then also, especially in this day and age, we need to kind of point that out. So there's very age appropriate things that kind of generally the issue here is among the young, respect for adults and respect for the elderly. This takes the form of how we look at them. It takes the form of how we speak to them, forms of address that we greet them.
Mhm.
It also includes, I mean, obviously, we're not looking right now to kind of share, well, this is what we do as a practicum
Mhm.
of really down in the weeds. But then even things like as then you have, say, a son who's 9 years old, 10 years old, you even practice when when an adult offers you your hand, this is how you hold it. You hold it firmly. You look at him. You say, hello, so and so. So you start to
Mhm.
bring in the posture things.
Mhm.
You start to bring in the shaking of hand or the not shaking of the hands. We believe that there's the old fashioned, and if you offer your hand, a man offers his hand to another man, and as a rule, and there can be exceptions, that a man waits for a woman to offer her hands to him. These
Mhm.
things those are still can be done. They can be done in a way. Part of it is you never do it in an ostentatious way, and we convey this to our children. Don't correct other people in their manners, because that's a part of manners. Don't do it if it's going to be ostentatious. Never do it as though you're acting as though you're better than someone by doing this, because of what the reason of it
Mhm.
is. Because it's always,
A
I am a member of a
courtesy.
community.
Yeah.
I want to act out of reverence for all other human persons.
And I think it's important for us to kind of, again, you said on the very practical level, in the household is where this begins. We have the challenge that these habits are not being reinforced in the bigger community, which puts more pressure on how you do it in your home. And depending on the age of your children, if you're homeschooling your children, you tend to be just within the family unit. We noticed that with great relief, we were driving to see an elderly woman who knew both of us, that our children hadn't met. And we spent the whole time over in the car saying, when Mrs. So-and-so says, our children were quite young. So this is, that kind of awkward moment for children where it's high pressure and a little bit embarrassing to have an adult focus their attention on you in that moment of, Magdalena, how are you? Or, and what's your name? It's kind of a terrifying moment for a child. And we spent the time in the car going over, so when Mrs. So-and-so says to you, how old are you? Make sure you look at her and speak clearly so she can hear. She's a little older. It's hard for her to hear. So speak very clearly. I'm 5 years old. So
Sure.
actually role play. And
Yep.
we were grateful. We realized, oh my goodness, if we kick around at home all the time, we would have never thought to do that, because it's not like you need to tell your child how to say how old they are to you.
Right.
So use opportunities of external interaction in the community as an occasion to teach your children certain manners. Or in other words, what I'm saying is be aware that courtesy
Yeah.
among family members at home does not necessarily cover it. There are going to be other things that you're going to
Totally.
need. So keep your eye out for opportunities to actually role play with young children and, even 7, 8, 9, because the manners that are necessary for them to be able to interact fruitfully and freely with other people in the community change as they get older. So just want to alert people that, wow, take the opportunity to practice with your children. It's not dumb. You're giving them tools to be free of awkward social situations.
But then let's go back to something that you said earlier. We avoid being anxious. How many times have we kind of made the mistake of then we're with, oh my goodness, here's a very important person that we're meeting. What if the child kind of messes up here and we can kind of go, no, don't say that.
So the point is, that's not the moment to teach your child. You need to remember
or to be upset.
Teach your child in a neutral situation.
Classic parental blunder. We're getting upset. Why did you not such and such? And of course, we're the ones who are informed on whether they, it's obvious why they don't really know such and such. But I love you. Both guests and going to other people's houses are key moments. They're key moments. Greetings, someone's arriving at your door, someone's arriving at your house. Even things like when someone arrives at our front door, we're getting up off of our seats, we're coming and we're greeting so-and-so. You don't keep sitting over there, reading a book. You certainly don't keep sitting over there scrolling through a phone. When someone comes to our house, boom, this is how you greet them. When we're going to someone else's house and we come in, you look around the room, you're aware of, you don't scream to someone necessarily at the far end, but you're doing your best to greet anybody by name here. There's just to be reeling some things off, dress.
Wait, before we go on to dress, I just want to say the reason we don't stay on our phone when someone walks in the door, even if it's not your guest, let's say someone's going to visit your parents and you're sitting, the reason you stand up, it's a way of acknowledging the presence and existence of that person. To not acknowledge the presence or existence of a person is a way to demean them and say, you're not really valuable. So, it sounds dumb to say that, but we are talking about being in a culture that doesn't convey these things. So I think it's also good to acknowledge the why. We're going to teach our children to stand up when a guest comes in the room. But for us, it's important to know why, because it acknowledges the goodness of their existence and their presence.
Especially in an age that more and more is impersonal, does not show respect, does not kind of enact the dignity and primacy of persons. Just to acknowledge their existence
and the presence,
to look at them, to smile. So many things here, smiling. When we, there's a little bit something conventional about the smiling, but hey, in any case, most of us here that we're talking about are Americans, and Americans, we tend to be, I'm grateful to say, more of a smiling culture. Other cultures can maybe do different things, but for us to smile is such a beautiful and powerful way to be able to say, I'm grateful to exist. I'm grateful that you exist. I am grateful to see you.
And I acknowledge your presence in a disconnected world. Presence is the challenge. Living present to one another. Amen. And these are things that reinforce presence.
Amen. Let's just mention in passing dress. That's a whole kind of topic in itself. Let's have a discussion another time about that. How we dress when we go to someone else's house. Again, we live in such an age of informality. I tease my students, when you're not in dress code, it looks like you're pretty much always wearing your pajamas. The normal common things we've just got. Well, why not wear something comfortable? Well, okay, there's a time to wear something comfortable, and there's a time to wear something that says, how I want to look for you is more important right now than my being completely comfortable and informal. So exactly what that's going to look like, let's just have another discussion on that another time. But that is part of manners.
I do want to say something else that's part of dress and manners is wearing something that is outrageous, like kind of for its shock value. Even things like outrageous hair, outrageous makeup, outrageous clothing. The reason that is kind of attacks good manners is that it imposes you on those you're with. It imposes you on their attention. If there's something very shocking about your clothing, whether it's shockingly immodest or shockingly different from the attire for an event or, shockingly whatever, it actually coerces people to have to make you the center of their attention. It just strikes people and they have to go and they notice it. So it's kind of a way of disrespecting the autonomy of the people you are greeting, that you're going to force them to either look at a certain body part or look at your shoes or, it becomes a distraction to free personal interaction. And so I think that's a pretty important thing in a culture where independence, creativity, frankly, shock value is very valued. There is a sense in which wearing shocking things is a way of imposing yourself upon others and coercing their attention.
I think that's a great point. I think that we'll call for a little more discussion when we do a specific discussion on
Sure.
that, because you're going to want to say that, of course, there's room for creativity. But I think that's a great.
Creativity does not necessarily have to be shocking.
No, that's exactly the point, and we need to make those distinctions. I do. I think that is a good example, and it's just. I think we also are going to want to circle back to that before we at least need to mention the table.
Yeah, and I think
Right.
that's important because that's the one place,
it's the centerpiece, really,
and
of
that
where we
you
start in the home.
and you re-encounter it over and over again. So it's really the perfect place for a lot of different principles of good manners, not just how you hold a knife and fork, but all kinds of manners of conversation can be not just introduced, but reinforced because you encounter one another at the table so frequently. So it's really kind of the opportunity par excellence to teach your family table manners and practice them yourself.
I mean, so a great place to begin, to be intentional, if we're spouses, if we're parents, whoever, we all have a household. So look at our household and begin with, let's talk about, start at 50,000 feet. How can we begin by practicing manners ourselves as ways of embodying our fundamental convictions about the gift of being human and how we interrelate to other humans? How does that start to show up then in particular areas? Eating together. How can we make our table a place that will embody, that will show forth our fundamental convictions about life and about what's most important?
Mm-hmm.
This is not to overshoot it. This is not to overstate it. Let's look at, is a little self-reflection of, is our eating together a kind of exemplification of gratitude, of respect, of reverence, of modesty, of shared joy. So many, sure, etiquette is part of that. I'm particularly more thinking about the things of how we address one another when we speak. There's so much manners of children learn. It's not that I don't like the line, children to be seen and not heard. Children need to understand they will be heard, but there is an aspect in which they need to listen first.
Mm-hmm.
And so when grandma speaks, will you stop speaking and you listen? Children need to be told that in gentle. This is a positive thing. It's not know your place, child. This is a beautiful opportunity to recognize, to honor our elderly. And we're going to recognize and honor you children too in your appropriate place, in the appropriate way. So that we look through, are we saying please? Are we saying thank you? Are we saying excuse me? Are we expressing gratitude to all those that should be? Meals should be so many ways centered around gratitude. Thanksgiving have a Eucharistic aspects to them that needs to be though embodied.
So I'm going to just come down a little bit from that 50,000 feet, which is so important. And just for the sake of being practical, the thing about table manners and why it's good to start teaching children from a very young age is that table manners is a place where you really see that manners are about safeguarding the comfort of others and making it possible for us to be together in community. So for example, a stupid manner that, has been passed on, point of etiquette, table etiquette, is don't chew with your mouth open. Why not? Who cares? I mean, so I chew with my mouth open. What's the big deal? If you say to a child, the person on the other who's speaking with you has to be looking at the food being masticated in your mouth, and it kind of is unpleasant to look at that. So you realize it's not just kind of a principle. If your children don't have certain manners of table interaction, eating, handling food, passing food, speaking, it actually makes it very unpleasant to sit down at the table. And those children grow into adults who have the same habits, and it's unpleasant to sit down at a meal with them. Yeah. And so I think it might be worthwhile to just kind of go through a lot of the standard kind of basic, obvious rules of etiquette and just say to yourself, how does this rule make it more pleasant or possible for someone to sit across the table from me and share a meal with me? I think it's valuable to think about it that way, because all of a sudden these things that just seem like rules, I have to remember, don't, hunch over my plate. Someone who hunches over their plate and is just kind of looking down at their plate and shoveling their food into their mouth, it precludes the possibility for conversation. It makes the meal a simply pragmatic thing of calories in, energy in, whereas it's supposed to be a place where we encounter persons. That was very helpful for me to kind of use that as a standard. How does this rule of etiquette make it more possible for the table to be a place of personal encounter? Make it possible and pleasant. Right. And then they become they're easier to remember. They give you kind of oomph to teach and enforce them. And I will say that at one point in our parenting life, we have 6 children. The first 5 were closer together, and then we had a little bit of a gap. But probably all 5 of them were already there. So varying ages. And I just remember sitting at the dinner table one time and thinking, my goodness, will dinner ever not be stressful? Because with 5 children, you're always teaching someone something new. And there are all kinds of infractions against manners that make it pleasant. So I just want to acknowledge sometimes it just gets really hard to be constantly enforcing table manners, but take heart. It does get better. Children do grow up. And especially if you're giving them that instruction and you're practicing it, lo and behold, you have a dinner table with your family. That's just a lovely place where every person sitting around the table is able to participate and be a member there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, there's we never really went into the male, female, man and woman, of which is very important that this be governed by manners, very particular manners that, again, by and large, in an age where everything's kind of leveled, we de-emphasize the difference between man and woman. That's not so much being done. So that, I think, is kind of a topic in itself. I think a number of these main areas, we've given some specifics. I really want to come back around and have some more concrete ones about the main areas that we've talked about. We will do that. But I hope in any case here, we've, been able to think together about the big picture and give some principles that can really give a sense of, we can do this. This is super important. This will make a big difference for ourselves. Great opportunity for self-renewal and how we give to others. And it's going to help us be a loving in our community.
Absolutely.
Thanks, dear. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Thanks for tuning in this episode of The Intentional Household. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review. If you have any topic requests, please send them to lifecraftgroup@gmail.com. For our Wednesday reflections, free courses, reading groups, and live events, please visit life-craft.org.